At the outset, it seems appropriate that you should know that I am neither a Muslim nor an Islamic scholar. Like Dr. Moore and Johnson, I work in the field, this is my area of research, in embryology, and it is a science that is concerned with all the changes that occur with the embryo, that is before birth, from the time of conception, that leads to the formation of a new individual. Rihal, one of the organizers of this evening's presentation, has brought to my attention that we have an audience from varying backgrounds, scientists and non-scientists, people with a wide range of interests. I've tried my best to organize what I will present to you with the great hope that there will be something for everyone. And if there are any questions or ambiguities, then my colleagues and I will try to answer these at the end. Religion and science do have some common goals, one being the pursuit of truth and the search for enlightenment. Fundamental to science and religion and philosophy is the question, the universal and timeless question regarding the nature of man. Indeed, we find just such a question in the Holy Qur'an. And if I may have the next slide, this first slide was so appropriate for the prayer. In fact, I brought it because it's a slide I always use for focusing the other slides. And it's such a pretty thing to look at this time of the year. Here we have a verse, a surah, which states, "From what substance had he created him?" And this is the timeless question of not only science or all philosophical discussions, but also of all religions. And in fact, this is what embryology is all about. As much as embryology deals with the genesis of all life forms, its history is inextricably related to the historical development of both scientific and philosophical thought. There are three phases if we look at the history of embryology, because we have to go into this a little bit in view of the fact of what I'll be telling you later with respect to the Qur'an. If we look at the history from time of antiquity up to the turn of the period with the beginning of our way of counting the years, we find that it was one where speculation predominated. And then came a descriptive phase where people observed things that were happening with chicken embryos or animal embryos, and they were describing those. And not until the 18th or 19th century, a new phase began where people began to play, to manipulate the embryo. They began to experiment with the embryo to understand how it develops. And that is what one would call an experimental phase. And more recently, there have been some very revolutionary approaches, the ultra-modern approaches, involving techniques we wouldn't need to talk about, that add a new dimension to our understanding of what happens with the embryo or fetus in utero, in the womb. As marvelous and awesome the discovery relating to human development before birth this century might be, there is so much that has already been recorded in the Holy Qur'an, some 1400 years ago. That is, long before any instrument or object, a tool, a microscope, or a lens might have been discovered to look at a structure in order to magnify it. Now, I have to pause here for a moment because I will ask your understanding. It's something that it took even a person like myself to grasp, and that is for you to relate to the time period we are talking about. If you go back 1400 years ago, or even 1800 years ago, we are in a different time frame, in a very entirely different environment, where perhaps they were thinkers, but no scientists in the sense that we know them, in the sense of people with white lab coats working in a laboratory doing experiments. They were simple people looking at things, making observations and describing these observations. They were scientists too, but they were of a different kind. And when they saw something that was unusual or something worth noting, they recorded these things too. And they were recorded with an equal simplicity. And this is what is the first point I want to draw your attention to, is the fact that if we were trying this evening, or we would try this evening, or you would be trying on your own, to relate the modern discoveries of sciences pertaining to the embryo, and as recorded in the great journals and scientific literature you find in the libraries today, to what has been recorded 1,000 years ago, then that would be difficult, because you're dealing with two entirely different environments, two different sets of people, different values, different criteria, different ways of observing things. But profound is the elegant simplicity. The elegant simplicity we find mentioned in the Qur'an, some remarkable statements on human prenatal development. And if I may have the next slide, please. From what substance had he created man? This, as I said, is one of the fundamental questions of religion and science. And a good starting point is perhaps with this gentleman you have here on the screen, Aristotle, who is known for a great many things, but he was the most celebrated thinker, philosopher, scientist of antiquity. He lived in the 4th century BC, 400 years, approximately 382 to 382 to 324 BC. And he seems to be a very appropriate starting point, because with him we could sort of grasp the kind of thinking that went on before, and we could see what the level of understanding of the embryo was at that time, about 400 years BC. Now Aristotle wrote in his book, which translated in English means the generation of animals, meaning the reproduction of animals, and a book he considered to be his masterpiece. In fact, both Charles Darwin, who many of you would know of, and a very famous scientist, Isaac Newton, they thought that Aristotle was the greatest scientist that ever lived. Aristotle, in his book, which he himself considered to be a masterpiece, wrote that the embryo evolved from the egg, and the egg comes from the female. Even though the psyche, that is the principle of life, was derived from the male, but how he did not know. And the womb merely serves as an incubator for the formless mixture of menstrual flow and semen. For centuries after Aristotle, the thought was that the womb was an incubator, and the menstrual flow somehow coagulated with the semen. And essentially what happens is that the embryo is formed, or the potential for the embryo to be formed exists once a month, not because of an egg, but because of the menstrual flow. This was the concept for centuries. And even, if we may have the next slide please, after the discovery made by this gentleman, who lived in the 17th, the latter part of the 17th, and the early part of the 18th century. And this is a gentleman, a Dutchman, by the name of Leeuwenhoek, some of you would have heard of the name, who found a way of taking a piece of glass and grinding it, putting it together, making a microscope, how simple it might have been, to make things look bigger. This was not discovered until about 200 to 300 years ago. And when this discovery was made, then one was in a position to look at an egg that might have come from a dog, or to look at an embryo that might have been developing like a chick embryo. But it did not add anything new as far as our understanding until much later with respect to the contribution, the relative contribution of the male and the female towards the formation of a new individual. To make my point very clear to you, I will show you on the next slide what one saw in the 17th century in the head of sperm. It just shows the extent of one's imagination. And there are, in the libraries of the world, you'll find many volumes, books with hundreds of pages of drawings showing you a little man, a little dog, a little rabbit, a little girl sitting in the head of a sperm. And that was supposed to be, some of you would know, the so-called homunculus, which over a period of 9 months or so in the womb would unfold and become a new individual. So the theory was now changing and shifting from the menstrual flow, the female egg, to now solely the male. And again, the uterus or womb was like an incubator. And this was 200-300 years ago. If we may have the next slide, please. But here we have a statement which I find most remarkable personally. Because here is a statement coming from a much earlier period. In the Holy Qur'an, we find in this surah, 39, the remarkable statement, He makes you in the wombs of your mothers in stages, one after another, in 3 veils of darkness. It's a surah I'm sure most of you are familiar with. It's a very simple statement. But then reflect back again what I've said at the very beginning. The time period we are thinking of, it's not in the 20th century. A lot of us looking at this statement in the 20th century would look at it and say, it's a very trivial, frivolous statement. It's true, so what's the big deal? But if you go back in time and think, it's a profound statement with very important facts. It says, He makes you in the womb, in the uterus of your mothers, in stages. It's not something that is formed completed, as I showed you earlier, that will unfold itself. It's a progressive thing. One after the other, there is a stage that is formed, and it leads to another stage, and there's another stage, and then there are 3 veils of darkness which surround these different stages as these stages unfold. And if we may have the next slide, please. And here is a photograph I have. I've drawn very heavily from the works of my colleagues, Dr. Johnson and Dr. Moore, particularly Dr. Moore, because on previous occasions they have talked on these topics, and I felt that why should I reinvent the wheel? And I've gone back to their work and referred to it. And in fact, this slide you're seeing here is one that is taken from Dr. Moore's paper that he presented, I believe, to this group on a previous occasion. And it shows here the embryo, or fetus as it is now, in the womb, and 3 veils of darkness as Dr. Moore at that time conceived it, and is willing to change his mind because of discussions we have had with Islamic scholars over the years. And there are all sort of variations to this, but the important thing is, if you look, you will see here the wall of the abdomen, of the belly, the wall of the uterus, and here what is known as the amnion and chorion for those who are in the audience. Some may say if you dismiss the wall of the abdomen, you could have the wall of the uterus, you could have the amnion, the chorion, and what is known as the decidua. These would be things that do exist, that we could not have known of their existence. The most if anyone could have conceived of, well, sure, it is in the uterus, and outside of the uterus we have the abdominal wall. The third would have still been difficult to have known about, but here we have recorded these 3 veils of darkness, surrounding the embryo as it is unfolding its stages in its development. Next slide, please. Now, if we go back in history, and as one of my hobbies, I'm interested in the history, like many of you, of medicine, and this is one of the things that got me involved in what I'm doing here this evening, because of the attraction of bridging the two things, the science, history, and religion. We find that there are many drawings depicting the womb, but none with a fetus in it, or an embryo. This is the first you're seeing. The first known drawing that was made in the 14th century by the famous, celebrated Leonardo da Vinci. Leonardo da Vinci was probably one of the greatest of geniuses to have lived, a man accomplished in so many areas. And here we have a drawing of the womb in which he depicted a child sitting in it. And this is the first we know in the 14th century. That's almost 1,000 years after. I'm not saying that there might not have been the concept or the view that the uterus could contain a child or a fetus, but here is the first depiction of that. Next slide, please. But here is a surah, one again, very powerful, very profound, in fact the whole of embryology here, and one of great but elegant simplicity. We, God, created man from a quintessence of clay. We then placed him as a nutfa, drop, in a place of settlement, firmly fixed. Firmly fixed. Each statement here is profound. The nutfa, place of settlement, firmly fixed. Then we made the drop into an alaqa, a leech-like structure. And then we changed the alaqa into a mudga, tube-like substance. Then we made out of that mudga bones, itham, and then we clothed the bones with flesh, laham. Then we caused him to grow and come into being and attain the definitive form. So blessed be God, the best to create. Here we see not only a description of the stages, but names given to the stages. Names given to the stages that accurately characterize the features of those stages as we know them today. And these were descriptions and names that have been put together 1400 years ago. Could I have the next slide, please? Now the nutfa. What is the nutfa? There are many concepts of this. The word may have two meanings, as Dr. Johnson wrote in one of his papers. It could be a drop, and the second is a small amount of water. And many interpreters of the Qur'an have referred to this meaning of the word. As stated in the Qur'an, we then placed him as a nutfa in a place of settlement. You must bear in mind that when this was mentioned in the Qur'an, at that time, scientists, if they can be called scientists, or thinkers and philosophers, believed that the human being was created from menstrual blood. The place where the nutfa rests in the uterus has been described in the Qur'an as garar, a place of settlement. In recent years, science has discovered many facts regarding the collective description of how the uterus expands to accommodate the fetus and provides it with a suitable place of settlement. According to many interpreters, the word makin means firmly fixed and refers to the relationship of the uterus to the body of the mother. Its firm positioning in the body is described in the Quran, and thus the relationship between the fetus and uterus and between the uterus and the body of the mother are so beautifully encompassed by the meaning of the two words qarar and makin. So if we may have the next slide, please. And this is what we would understand as a nutfa, After the egg has been fertilized, it forms what is known as a zygote, and the zygote then changes and becomes a structure that has many more cells, and these things are given different names. But this would be our interpretation of a nutfa, and a place of settlement would be in the walls of the uterus, firmly fixed, the uterus firmly fixed in the mother. Next slide, please. And here we see a statement, even then, that makes it quite clear. It's not the male, it's not the female, it's not menstrual blood. Verily, we created man from mixtures of germinal drops. Next slide, please. And that he did create the two sexes even, the male and female, from that drop, that zygote, as it is emitted or planned. And this planning, we could spend the whole evening talking about planning. It could encompass everything of the child, of the new individual, with respect to genetic programming, and that is there that will determine the characteristics of the child. Next slide, please. And this is a summary to show you again, just a simple drawing, a sketch to show you the egg being fertilized here, and the fertilized egg traveling. This would be the nutfa. It travels along here until it reaches the wall of the uterus, when it attaches itself, a firm place of settlement, and then we have the other stages that will then progress. Next slide, please. And here we come to this then out from a sperm drop, and you notice here is a different interpretation of the word nutfa here, a sperm drop. This is a literal translation. I would like to put then out from a zygote, nutfa, then from a leech-like clot, aracha, the next stage, which is like a leech, then from a tube-like structure, mudka, and could we have the next slide, please? And this is what an embryo looks like immediately after that stage. After the nutfa stage, we go into the alaka stage, and this is what a leech looks like. It's a drawing again from Dr. Moore's work. And here is what an embryo would look like at that stage. The similarity in features. Now this happens towards the end of the 3rd week. Very, very early and very small for you to see, for one to be able to see anything with the naked eye and even with a simple lens. And during the 4th week, we'll move on please, next slide. Well, this is again a slide to show you here the transfer from the alaka into the mudga. The tube substructures here, you can see some of them here. These are things that are called somites. They're present here. This is what it looks like at the end, by the end of the 4th week. Next slide, please. And this is a special technique, a scanning electron micrograph of an embryo at the end of the 4th week. You could see here those chewed-like impression, as if you took a piece of meat and you were chewing in it, and this would leave the kind of impression here. This is very, very characteristic. And this is the end. This is the head of the embryo. All of this will form its face. That's the heart. And this is what a human embryo, this is not a rat, this is a human embryo, looks at the end of the 1st month. And the word mudga means something that has been chewed by the teeth. The small matters, a piece of meat, the size that can be chewed. By day 26 to 28 in development, the embryo appearance changes to that of a chewed substance. Now the somites, the ones I showed you here, are very characteristic of that stage. The short time involved with the change from alaka to mudga is also indicated in the Qur'an by the use of the conjunctive fa, meaning then. And as all of you probably know, better than I do, the word fa indicates a sequential order. One thing leading into another without a long delay. it's happening very quickly, and so it is in the human. Thus far, modern embryological observations apply completely with these descriptions of the stages of embryonic development as listed and as presented in the Quran. Next slide, please. Now this is very interesting. This is a piece of plasticine, I think, a piece of gum or so. Dr. Moore took it, put it in his mouth and chewed on it just to see what it would look like. And you could see it does give the appearance of chewed substance. Am I right, Keith? Yes. And this is a very, it's remarkable when you compare these two things with the embryos I showed you earlier. The similarity in structure is evident here with regards to these things I've described the somites. Next slide, please. And now, from mudga, then we made up of that mudga bone. Now, this sequence is very important. Idham. Then we clothe the bones with flesh, lacham, muscle. And then we get to the next stage. But here are distinct stages described. And again, I ask you to go back to the time frame because I am so much impressed by it that I have to keep on reminding you not only the time period, but its simplicity of life at that time in describing things, how it would be described. It wouldn't be in great protocols and great prestigious journals. These would be simple statements of facts, observations made, because these are observations that were made or that were revealed, that were put together for what they were worth. Then we made the drop into an alakha, we have seen that, into a mudga, and then we have got the idam and lacham here. These are all distinct stages, progressing from something that is very simple, a drop, to something that is becoming more complex. And we see a sequence of events. And these words then and then in the Quran, when you look at the translation and then, they're either fa or tuma. One meaning happening very quickly, as you know, and the other meaning happening with delay. And the sequencing of these two are exactly as we know them today. Could we have the next slide, please? And here is a human embryo that is just at the end of 6th week going into the 7th week, where we begin to see changes. This is a human occurring in the bones. A special technique of making the embryo or fetus transparent, and then a special staining technique is applied so that we can then see the bones or what will become bones. These things, as some of you know, will start as cartilages, and out of the cartilages bones will be formed. For example, here are the jaws, nicely shown. Here is the bone, the collarbone here, and here we have bones of the arm, here in the skull. But the important point is we have the beginning of the stage we talked about earlier, idham, happening, and shortly thereafter other things begin to happen. Next slide, please. Here. All of this happening within a matter of a week or two, until we have now a fetus which is about 12 weeks old, 12 weeks, 3 months old, and here you could see a fair amount of the skeletal system of the bones which have appeared. Next slide, please. But concurrently with those changes, you can't see them because that fetus has been made transparent. There are the changes associated with the clothing of that idham with flesh, lacham. And here we see, and clothe the bones with flesh. We can stop there and move on to the next slide, please. Because here is a fetus. In fact, it's a stage of an embryo going to a fetus where bones are already present. We have a very simple hand being formed. It will, over the next few months, it will become more complicated to become the real things we have. And here we have the leg. We have a very simple head here, features of the face, some characteristics that resemble human but not exactly human. But the sequence, the point I wish to make here is this. The sequential ordering of the events in fetal development and the close timing between the fourth and fifth stages which I've described of idham and laham respectively, as described to in the Qur'an, are in full agreement with contemporary embryological observations. And could we move on please to the next slide? Now that's a very interesting statement again, a hadith. When 42 nights have passed over the conceptus, God sends an angel to it who shapes it. Now that's approximately, as you recall, as you know, it's after the 6th week, and in fact 6 weeks would be what I've shown you just a little bit earlier, those 3 embryos. God sends an angel to it who shapes it into human form and makes it ears, eyes, skin, muscles and bones, and I wouldn't go into the rest. But the point I'm trying to make here, we're talking about human development as conceived and documented a very long time ago. And the next slide please. Because before the 42 weeks, as we know it, this is what the face of an embryo would look like. These are the different parts that will have to come together to make our nose, our face, our forehead, as we would like to have it as attractive as it could be. And the next slide, please. And this is what the arms look like. All of this before the 42 days. And the next slide, please. But now comes the dramatic changes. Because just a week later, after that 42 days, just about 10 days later, all those structures become transformed slowly and are beginning to look like something that is human. With human characteristics, at least human external characteristics. Could I have the next slide, please? And here we have a fetus, which is now during its 12th week of development. We see here the skin, well-developed muscles, bones, in fact, all recognizable features of the new individual are here. In fact, they are here long before this period. Next slide, please. We have well-defined fingers with nails being formed, as you can see. Next slide. And here the toes, which you didn't have. In fact, you had something, a flat paddle before that period. Next slide, please. Now the external genitalia, the external sex organs, if you want to look at it. There is a lot in the Qur'an about sexual development. Time will not allow us to go into that. But let me finish that hadith for you. Then he says, O Lord, is it male or female? And your Lord decides what he wishes, and the angel records it. The point I wish to make is this. By the 4th week of development, the sex of that individual, the anlaga we call it, the anlaga, the early features are already there but not evident. No one could recognize them. By 9th week, as you can see here, they are distinguishing features. And only during the 12th week can you differentiate between the male and the female. So the timing of all of this is correct as given here. Next slide, please. That's the male, this would be the female here. Only at the 12th week would you be able to distinguish these two things. Next slide, please. And now comes a very interesting phase, and that is what I would like to describe as the final phase, the Nasha phase. The rapid growth and developmental changes of the fetal period, which occur after the bones have been clothed by the muscles, I've already mentioned to you. And we clothe the bones with muscle, does Surah 23 say. Then we cause him to grow and attain and come into being and attain the definitive human form. The Quran uses the word anashanahu regarding the attainment of human form, which in fact corresponds to the fetal period. Next slide, please. And it is these dramatic changes which all of us are familiar with, occurring after that period, that we see this Nasha period, this Nasha Nahu period, that leads to the development of, or to the manifestation of a full-fledged newborn infant. Next slide, please. Which you have here. And so we see that 1400 years ago, from the very few verses, not to take more time because my colleagues will have to speak and we have a discussion to go on, we have terms that have been recorded that are descriptive of stages that have been identified very clearly, showing the sequence of events from the nutfah stage, and not just the nutfah stage, but what will happen to that nutfah within the womb itself, through changes of alaqa, mudghah, idham, until we get to the final phase of nasha, as we can see here. And with that, I would like to stop now. Thank you very much for your attention.